countries have not kept to their promise, have not kept to their part of the bargain. Firstly, the Kyoto Protocol figures have not been concluded. There is very little progress on either an aggregate figure or individual figures. And whatever figures have been pronounced by different countries show an overall very low level of ambition. The estimate that if you include the United States, that the alliance of small island states has done, very good scientific analysis, is that the reduction that has been put on the table is only between 12 to 19% by 2020 compared to 1990. So you may have a midpoint of, let's say, 16%. And this comes also with offsets, meaning this is not a domestic effort. It includes the offsets that they are paying developing countries to do for them. If you remove the offsets, then you may have something like maybe 12 or 13% only. We don't even know what the figure is. Now this is a very low level of ambition because we had already agreed at the end of 2012 to achieve minus 5.2% compared to 1990. In fact, where Europe is concerned, it is minus 8%. So from minus 8% to minus 16%, and then with offsets, it's even less than that. It's not much of an effort. But on top of this comes the implied intention of these members of the Kyoto Protocol that are from the developed countries to disband their commitment in the Kyoto Protocol and to shift to the convention where the United States is located and to join the United States in this paragraph 1B1. Now that constitutes a downgrading of commitment from an internationally legally binding commitment, that is the Kyoto Protocol, with a compliance system, with an aggregate figure, into an unknown territory of a new treaty, a new protocol that is being proposed, which it is possible, in fact it is likely, if you look at the proposals coming from the United States, from Australia and so on, will comprise the individual targets that each country is willing to put forward, and not to have an aggregate figure that is based on what is scientifically required or necessary. And as we have seen, the individual targets that each government or parliament has put forward constitutes a very low level of ambition. Secondly, that new protocol is likely to be not internationally legally binding, unlike the Kyoto Protocol. And thirdly, there will be what the NGOs call a system of pledge and review. We just pledge what we can do, and then we welcome everybody to review whether what we have done is sufficient or not. It will not have a compliance system, and it is not internationally legally binding. So this leaves the developing countries in a very difficult predicament. If this plan were to be implemented, then the developed countries would not be keeping to their part of the bargain, but the developing countries are asked to do more than what they have ever done before. And on top of that, during the negotiations, some developed countries have been putting more and more obligations beyond the Bali Action Plan understanding onto developing countries, such as the call for some advanced developing countries to also take on reduction commitments, such as the call for major emitting developing countries to pledge what they can do and to subject themselves to international review, similar to what they are willing to do themselves. Of course, there are so many problems with this because there is no agreed definition of what is an advanced developing country or what is a major emitting developing country. There is no agreed definition. If your country has a very big population, does that make you an advanced developing country? If your population emits more than another country because it is a big population, does that mean that you are a major emitter? You come into so many philosophical, methodological, equity issues and so on. So the first thing that we need really to clarify in the next 10 days, if we are to get a result in Copenhagen, if you listen to the speeches made by the developing country leaders yesterday, the G77 and China, the Africa Group, the LDCs, the small island states and so on, the developing countries are very united in that they want to keep the two tracks of the negotiations. They want a conclusion of the Kyoto Protocol with an environmentally effective, ambitious aggregate figure and corresponding figures for each developed country in the Kyoto Protocol, a clarity that the Kyoto Protocol will continue into a second commitment period, and that the United States will, through the other track, make a comparable effort which will then be committed in the other track. And then the third component, which is the developing countries will do their part in subjecting their mitigation actions that are supported by finance and technology to measurement, reporting and verification. So this is a mitigation component, and this is the architecture agreed to in Bali, and the architecture that must be maintained through a decision in Copenhagen if we are to have a successful conclusion. There are 2 or 3 other issues which are simpler. One is on finance. It is a legal commitment by the developed countries that they will finance the climate actions of the developing countries. But the record of the last 15 years has been very meager. And therefore, the developing countries are asking for 3 or 4 things. The first and most important is the setting up of a fund inside the convention with different windows to do different activities. This fund will be governed by a board made up of representatives from the different regions, and the fund will carry out the instructions of the Conference of Parties as to how to use the fund, how to disperse it, to whom, and so on. The second thing that is being demanded is that a sizable amount of funds be given to this fund. The G77 and China has put forward a figure of around 1% of the GNP of the developed countries. That is equivalent to $400 billion per year. But since the estimate given by the G77, there have been other studies that have come up from the United Nations, from universities in England and so on, that this figure of 1% may be underestimated, and that something nearer to 1.5 to 2% of GNP, that is $800 billion to $1 trillion, is more realistic if we are to finance the actions that are needed. The third issue is technology transfer. The convention does not have a decision-making body on technology transfer. It only has an advisory body. So the demand of the G77 and China is that a new structure be created inside the convention on technology policy and the implementation of technology transfer. And this new body will deal with issues such as what kinds of technologies are required, how to access these technologies at the most affordable cost, what are the barriers to technology transfer and how do we overcome the barriers, and how do we help developing countries to develop technologies on their own. The final issue that is of concern to developing countries is that outside this convention, measures are being planned to introduce a new kind of trade protectionism based on climate change grounds. The US Congress, for example, has already adopted through the House of Representatives a bill that states that the US President has to introduce a new kind of financial charge on imports coming from developing countries that do not cooperate on climate change in sectors which are energy intensive. So there is a growing concern among developing countries that the Convention's principles of equity, of developed countries paying developing countries to take actions are being violated through a non-convention action, which is tantamount to trade protectionism based on climate change grounds. So the demand of the developing countries is that the Copenhagen decision contain a paragraph that states that the developed countries shall not take trade protectionist measures such as border tax adjustments or carbon tariff on the products and services of the developing countries. This is something that they want to be as a decision inside the convention. Will there be success in Copenhagen? I think the next 8 to 10 days are going to be very crucial. The developing countries are striving very hard. They are working day and night. They want a deal that is both environmentally effective, meaning high levels of ambition of reductions, as well as that it's fair. And the symbols as to whether it is fair is whether big reduction cuts are going to come from the developed countries and whether finance and technology commitments are going to be met. Thank you very much.